Ready for a deep dive into some seriously intense philosophy?
Let's do it.
We're tackling Nietzsche today, specifically his work on the genealogy of morality.
It's a fascinating read, that's for sure.
You provided some excerpts, and we're going to unpack his ideas about where morals really come from. Get ready for some aha moments about good versus evil, the surprising origin of guilt.
And maybe even why lambs shouldn't write ethical codes.
Exactly! It's going to be a wild ride. So Nietzsche, he's known for really turning our assumptions upside down.
He really does. See, most people, they just assume, okay, good and evil, right and wrong, those are just givens, right? Like universal truths.
Yeah, like built into the fabric of the universe or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Nietzsche comes along and says, nope, not so fast. He argues that our ideas about morality, they're not objective truths at all. They're products of history, power struggles.
Oh, this is where it gets juicy. The idea that morality is more about who has power than some kind of absolute good.
Right. And he digs into that with this idea of master versus slave morality.
Okay, break that down for me. Master versus slave morality. What's that all about?
So the masters, as Nietzsche calls them, they were the ones who originally defined good based on their own values, their own strength, nobility, actions.
Okay, so it's like the victors rate the history books, right?
Exactly. Think about ancient Greek heroes. Their morality wasn't about being nice. It was about embodying excellence, having courage, asserting their will.
So it's more about having the power to define what's considered good based on your own values.
Exactly. Now, anything that was seen as weak, submissive, that was bad in the eyes of the masters.
And this is where we get into how even language reflects those power dynamics, right? Like you highlighted in the excerpts how in ancient Greece, words for the common people often had pretty negative connotations.
Exactly. The language itself was shaped by who had the power to define the term.
It's like the whole system reinforces itself.
Right. And this is where Nietzsche sees a major turning point in the history of morality. He argues that when the priestly class, those who were often associated with weakness and resentment in this master-slave framework, gained influence, well, they flipped the script.
So instead of strength and assertiveness being seen as good, suddenly it's humility, compassion, turning the other cheek. Those become the new moral compass.
Exactly. It's not necessarily a deliberate or malicious takeover, but this more subtle shift in how values are perceived and internalized.
It's like a cultural reprogramming.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. Nietzsche, he talks a lot about the will to power. So even if he sees these systems as flawed, doesn't he also admire the sheer audacity it takes to establish a set of values in the first place?
That's a really insightful point, and it gets to the complexity of Nietzsche. You're right. He doesn't necessarily condemn the act of creating values in itself. He sees this struggle for meaning, for imposing some kind of order on a chaotic world, as a fundamental part of what it means to be human. What he critiques is the underlying motivation behind those systems, and of course their consequences.
So it's not about whether a moral system is objectively right or wrong. It's about whether it's life-affirming, whether it ultimately allows us to flourish as individuals and as a society.
Precisely. Nietzsche wants us to question those deeper impulses. Are we creating and upholding values out of a place of love for life, a desire to embrace its fullness? Or are we driven by fear, resentment, a need to control and dominate? Those are the questions that really matter.
Okay, so we've talked about how Nietzsche sees morality as something that's evolved over time, shaped by power dynamics and even resentment. But where does guilt fit into all of this?
Guilt. That's a big one for Nietzsche. It's something we tend to take for granted, right? Like you mess up, you feel bad. End of story. But Nietzsche, he's not content with just accepting these things at face value. He wants to know, where does this capacity for guilt even come from?
Right, because it feels so primal, so ingrained. Is he saying it's not?
Well, he argues that this bad conscience, this guilt we feel, it's not something we're just born with. He actually traces it back to a major shift in human history, the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to more settled agricultural communities.
Interesting. So instead of chasing our next meal, we're planting crops, building fences, forming more complex social structures.
Exactly. And that shift, it demanded a whole new set of skills, new ways of behaving, delayed gratification, long-term planning, adhering to social contracts. We had to learn to suppress those more immediate instinctual impulses.
It's like trading the thrill of the hunt for the stability of a farm, right? You can't just grab what you want anymore. You have to cooperate, share resources.
Exactly. And with that comes the need for rules, for punishment, for enforcing those new social norms. So Nietzsche argues that over time, those external punishments, they became internalized. That's how bad conscience develops. It's like we took the rule book and we made it part of our own mental framework.
So even when no one's watching, that little voice in your head is there to dole out the guilt trip.
Exactly. And that connects to another key part of his argument, the creditor-debtor relationship.
Right. He talks about how in ancient societies, debt wasn't just about owing money. It was this really intense personal bond.
And the punishments for defaulting on those debts, they were brutal. Nietzsche, he sees echoes of that ancient dynamic in how we experience guilt.
So the guilt we feel, that sense of owing, even if it's just to ourselves, it's like a form of self-imposed punishment.
Precisely. We internalize those rules, those expectations, and then we become both the debtor and the debt collector in our own internal moral economy.
That's a pretty heavy burden to carry around. But how does this understanding of guilt connect to, modern morality?
Well, Nietzsche argues that in modern times, especially with the influence of Judeo-Christian morality, guilt becomes even more intense. And here's the crucial part. It becomes detached from any possibility of true repayment.
What do you mean, detached from repayment? That sounds ominous.
Think about the concept of sin. It's not like you wrong a specific person and you can apologize, make amends, offer restitution.
Right, it's this kind of nebulous debt to a higher power, to God.
Exactly. And this debt, it's often framed as something that can never be fully repaid. So instead of that more concrete eye for an eye kind of justice, you have this lingering sense of transgression, this feeling of being fundamentally flawed. It's like you're stuck in some kind of cosmic debtor's prison with no hope of parole.
So this bad conscience, this intense, almost inescapable guilt, Nietzsche sees it as a defining feature of modern morality.
He sees it as a symptom of a deeper unease, a kind of spiritual debt that we're constantly trying to pay off, even if we don't fully understand what we owe or to whom. And this leads us to another fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of his work, his analysis of asceticism.
Okay, so we've got this feeling of guilt, this bad conscience that Nietzsche says is so central to modern morality. And now we're bringing in asceticism, this idea of renouncing pleasure, embracing suffering. I'm not going to lie, it seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? Like, why would anyone choose to suffer more? Especially when we're already carrying around all this guilt and inadequacy. But Nietzsche, he sees asceticism as a response to that very unease.
Really? So it's like, instead of just feeling bad about ourselves, we decide to make ourselves really uncomfortable.
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but
Yeah.
you're getting at something important. Nietzsche argues that when we're faced with the potential meaninglessness of existence, that horror of acuity, he talks about the fear of emptiness. Asceticism becomes a way to create a sense of order, of control, even if it's through self-denial.
So it's like we'd rather choose the terms of our own suffering than face the chaos of a world without inherent meaning.
Exactly. By embracing hardship, denying our desires, we gain a sense of agency. It's like saying to the universe, okay, maybe life is meaningless, but I'm choosing this. I'm in control here.
That's a pretty powerful idea. But I'm sensing that Nietzsche doesn't fully endorse this whole asceticism thing, right? Because you mentioned how he analyzes Schopenhauer, and he was all about denying desires, embracing a pretty bleak outlook on life.
Right. Nietzsche is both drawn to and wary of asceticism. He sees its potential for discipline, for focus, but also its potential to become life-denying. And Schopenhauer, he's like a case study for that tension.
So was Schopenhauer a brilliant philosopher because he was so into self-denial? Or was he just a naturally gloomy guy whose worldview happened to produce some interesting ideas?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Nietzsche wrestles with. He doesn't give us a simple answer, because there isn't one. What he does is force us to examine those assumptions. Do we create our best work, our most profound insights, by pushing back against our desires, embracing discomfort? Or is that just a romanticized notion?
It's like this idea of the tortured artist. Does suffering really equal depth?
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Nietzsche doesn't limit his critique of asceticism to artists and philosophers. He even goes after scientists and free thinkers.
No way! You'd think those guys would be the least likely to embrace self-denial.
You'd think so, right? But Nietzsche, he challenges him too. He's like, hey, you say you value logic and reason, but are you really free from these ascetic ideals? He suggests that even those who reject traditional religion, they might still be operating within a subtly ascetic framework.
So even if you ditch the dogma, that underlying impulse towards self-denial, it might still be lurking in the shadows.
Exactly. It's like saying, just because you traded in your horse and buggy for a Tesla, it doesn't mean you've escaped the laws of physics. We're all still bound by certain deeper patterns of thought and behavior, even when we're not aware of them.
Okay, so where does this leave us? How do we put all these pieces together? What are we supposed to do with all these Nietzschean insights?
That's the big question, isn't it? And maybe the most valuable thing Nietzsche offers isn't a set of easy answers, but rather the tools to start asking more critical questions. He's not trying to tell us what to think, but rather how to think.
It's like he's handing us a philosophical toolbox and saying, go deconstruct the world, starting with your own assumptions.
Precisely. And through that process of questioning, deconstructing, maybe even reconstructing, we can start to create lives that are truly life-affirming, lives that aren't built on fear or resentment or the need to control, lives that embrace the fullness of what it means to be human.
I love that. It's a challenge for sure, but also an incredibly hopeful one. A huge thank you to you and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this wild ride through the mind of Nietzsche.